Farmers of America, which is the greatest youth organization ever created, in my opinion, take a topic that's relevant to agriculture. They have to evenly present both sides of that topic without coming to a conclusion. So they're going to present pro arguments and con arguments on their topic. So part of the competition is that 15-minute skit, we should say. Then the second part of the competition is for them to answer questions from the judges in the audience. And you members of the audience are going to be the judges, so you are free to ask the students any question that you want. And they are judged on their responses to you. I will tell you, this is the very first practice these kids have had in front of an audience. So we don't have the skits quite memorized. By the time the state competition in April, they will have them memorized so they can say them backwards. But the competition just started, so you got to give them a few minutes here. Once we finish the question and answer part, what is really going to be helpful for the students is for them to ask you questions. If they have questions from you, for example, you ask them a question they didn't quite understand, or how would you phrase this, or how would you say that, this will be the student's opportunity to ask you questions. The other thing that is really helpful is if you have any pointers for them on their presentation, how maybe you didn't understand a word or a phrase. Maybe somebody has an annoying speaking habit, like messing with their hair or their jewelry. If you'll point out those things, because they're judged on their presentation, their speaking skills, their ability to answer questions, all of that goes in to the state and national competition. And so working on those now with somebody watching besides Mr. Allen, Sarah, and I is really helpful. I will tell you, Cheyenne has always done extremely well in these competitions. The Cheyenne schools win state when they compete, and we have never finished lower than the semifinals in the national competition. So these kids are the best and the brightest, and you can watch all those kids on TV and really be worried about our country. You watch these kids, and you're going to think it's going to be okay. These are impressive students. So if there are no questions.
One thing is the students have to portray accurate opinions from real life individuals, and so some of the students will say things up here that they do not necessarily agree with personally.
Because there's one that's CBD, and we don't agree.
And it's very hard for them to learn their parts, but it is also part of the competition.
All right, are you guys ready? Okay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Cliff Bench from the Farm Community of Oregon and the chairman of the National House Subcommittee on Fisheries and Wildlife. Today we are holding a committee meeting in acknowledgement of the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Endangered Species Act. The act was signed on December 20th, 1973 to protect species that had populations that were becoming close to extinct to eventually restore the population. The monarch butterfly is one of the recent species under consideration for listing under the ESA. However, this species is a prominent concern as the migration pattern of the monarch will affect the entirety of the United States, not any specific region. The monarch butterfly was petitioned to be listed in 2020 and has been sent into a 12-month review with a decision to be made by the late months of 2023. This is a pressing issue as the listing of the monarch will change the dynamic of agricultural way of living across the nation. The purpose of today's committee hearing is to present the question of incentivizing the ESA to discuss if it is good public policy or subsidy for landowners, to get ahead of potential consequence inflicting on property owners with the listing of the monarch. Acting as a witness on my right is Karen Bud Fallon, an agricultural lawyer here to explain the lack of effect the ESA has been providing to ensure the rehabilitation of the listing of species. To my left is Sharon Bushino, employee of the National Resource Defense Council, arguing that Section D of the ESA is working in effect to help rehabilitate listed species by the concept of take by the government. After testimony is concluded, the floor will be open to public debate. Mrs. Fallon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, sorry. My name is Karen Bud Fallon, owner of the Bud Fallon Law Firm in Cheyenne, Wyoming. I grew up as a fifth-generation rancher on my farmer's ranch in Big Piney, Wyoming. I have worked with the Trump administration as the lead attorney in revising the regulations implementing the Endangered Species Act, including the regulations recognizing the rights of local governments to protect the economic stability, customs, and cultures of their constituents. I currently work with the FFA by coaching teams and teaching students about agricultural issues in America. The Endangered Species Act, while in effect since the 1970s, has been ineffective in fulfilling the purpose it has been implemented for, restoring the endangered species populations to get them off the list. Throughout the time of the ESA, only 2% of the species have ever been actually recovered in the last 50 years. Mind you, this is only 99 species out of a total of over 3,000 listings. Currently, 1,703 species have listings for recovery plans. However, there is no active effort being made to fulfill them. In order to productively carry out the purpose of the ESA, people behind agriculture can agree the government and organizations working for the proposed recovery plans will have to provide payments or incentives to farmers and ranchers to prevent accidental take of an endangered species that they have found habitat on their private property. The idea of take is defined as the killing, harassment, harming, or change of habitat or attempt to participate in this of an endangered species. The concept of take will have to be carefully monitored with a species like the monarch, as it is a smaller species and would impact everyday activities such as driving or even going to work. Because farmers would be key players in concentrating the population to provide a safe habitat, they should be compensated. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. The next testimony will be presented by Sharon Buccino from the Natural Resource Defense Council.
Good morning. My name is Sharon Buccino, and I am an employee of the Natural Resource Defense Council. My current work focuses on energy policy and government transparency. I actively litigate in federal court and advocate before federal agencies and Congress. Originally from Central Florida, I have spent over 25 years at NRDC's Washington, D.C. office. While I can agree with Karen that the ESA needs to focus on the recovery of the species, this cannot be done without the proper funding from the U.S. government for this specific purpose. With 1,703 species being listed for recovery plans, recovery efforts cannot begin without funds provided to designate critical habitat or sanctuaries to provide protection. Currently, the government provides $43.8 million in funding set aside for rehabilitation efforts. However, I believe that $1.7 billion a year should be designated to the ESA to maximize the protected species listed under the Act. Overall, I feel as though the ESA is working, but would be even more effective with the proper funding from the government. I feel as though there's also this misunderstanding with the ESA from landowners. Landowners should be protected by the Safe Harbor Agreement. A Safe Harbor Agreement is a voluntary agreement involving private or other non-federal property landowners whose actions contribute to the recovery of species listed under the listed as endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act. If you take steps to help a species like the monarch, you can still industrialize or farm. In exchange for actions that contribute to the recovery of listed species on non-federal lands, participating landowners receive formal assurances from the service that if they fulfill conditions of the SHA, the service will not require any additional or different management activities by participants without their consent. Because of the Safe Harbor Agreement, I feel as though there is no need to subsidize landowners for the ESA, for landowners still can carry out their livelihood under the agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. With this, the testimony is ended for the question of incentivizing the ESA to determine if it is subsidy for landowners or good public policy. Thank you to Ms. Bud Fallon and Ms. Buccino for your testimonies. Now the floor will be open for public comment. If you have comments, please come up to the podium and state your name.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Madison Isley, and I am currently the Vice President of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. My family and I manage a cow, calf, and custom haying operation for the historic King Ranch Company. I have been actively involved in NCBA since 2009, serving on the board of directors, several committees, and most recently as chair of the policy division. Respectfully, I disagree with the given testimony that the ESA should not be incentivized. I have endured personal experience with the Endangered Species Act when the Preble's jumping mouse was spotted living on my property. However, it was assumed that the species was making habitat over several acres of my property, as inspectors would simply search for open space for the species to live in. This made it difficult for me and surrounding farmers to use the land for farming and livestock. A listing like the monarch butterfly would be detrimental to the agricultural community, as the species is hard to contain and milkweed, their ideal habitat, is considered toxic to livestock and crops. Organizations that have been working with the ESA, such as NRDC and the Center for Biological Diversity, spend time writing petitions to get species listed on the ESA, but don't realize the impact that listing them has on the agriculture industry that is essential to feeding the rapidly growing population. When a species is listed, any property of a landowner is at risk of being designated as critical habitat, which will limit and hinder a family's ability to profit from their livelihood because the landowner is not allowed to adversely modify the habitat. Modifying can include applying herbicides, cattle grazing, or any number of agricultural practices. If the government would produce incentives such as funding or alternative land options to compensate farmers for lost property and livestock habitat to the ESA, farmers would be more willing to be cooperative with helping in the rehabilitation efforts, as they wouldn't struggle to make up for their profit from their jobs. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any further public comment?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Ms. Isley, I respectfully disagree. Hi, my name is Ryan Shannon. I am a 5-year employee based out of the Oregon office for the Center of Biological Diversity. I actively work within the company to enforce safeguards for the Endangered Species Act to protect the endangered species. The Center of Biological Diversity is a nonprofit organization that aims to create petitions to encourage the National Fish and Wildlife to list certain species under the ESA. Ms. Isley, while I can see your concern about the loss of property under the ESA has no effect on your private property. Under the 5th Constitutional Amendment, the federal courts cannot take your private property for a public purpose. Courts have decided that critical habitat is not a take of your private property. To combat other public concerns, there are hyperbolic beliefs that everyday life will be altered by the listing of the monarch butterfly. The idea of take is referring to the intentional harming or killing of an endangered species. The monarch is an insect that is something that we come into contact with almost daily in the warm months. By driving your car, you are not purposefully harming the species. Therefore, it is not considered a take. With this, I believe the ESA is working and will not need to be incentivized before the listing of the monarch, as the ESA has been the best thing to happen to endangered species. Based on statistics, 95% of the species listed under the Act have avoided extinction by being listed under the ESA. For these reasons, I do not believe the ESA needs to be incentivized. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shannon. Do we have any further public comment?
Mr. Chair, I would like to make a statement.
Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Aubrey Betancourt, and not only am I the president and CEO of the California Almond Growers Alliance, but I'm also a 4th-generation farmer from King County, California. I was first introduced to the ESA when the Delta smelt had prevented allocation of water to local farmers in California for up to 6 months of that year. Contrary to what CBD and NRDC have just stated, the ESA is not working and cannot work. Because this law has only been amended 4 times since it was signed into Act in 1973, I believe that amending it 4 times is not enough to comply with the beliefs and practices of today's society. The modernization or lack of modernization of this act is not its only flaw. The act also does not allow proper compensation to private landowners, therefore discouraging cooperation between landowners and the government.
Mr.
I have
Chair,
recently
contrary to what Aubrey has stated, farmers and ranchers are lacking much needed collaboration between themselves, organizations like CBD and NRDC, and the government.
Thank you for bringing that up, Sharon. As I was just about to say, I have recently been working with some cattlemen to create a voluntary program that would create incentives for private landowners to better cooperate with designated critical habitat policies of the ESA. Not because we believe it is the best solution to this problem, but because there is no better option for us. We can either commit to this program or lose our livelihood. The listing of the monarch butterfly has brought to light how detrimental the policies of the ESA are to landowners once it is officially listed. The milkweed that monarchs lay their eggs on and rely on it for their main food source is harmful or even deadly to livestock or crops. If we don't continue to modernize the ESA by incentivizing it with land alternatives or money, American farmers and the monarch butterfly will pay the consequences. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bentoncourt.
This is why rural areas should be left to the wildlife, and urban areas are where the people should live.
Okay, and with that, all public comments will no longer be taken. Thank you, Mrs. Bud Fallon and Mrs. Buscino, for your testimonies. Additionally, thank you, Ms. Isley, Ms. Shannon, and Mrs. Bentoncourt for your additional comments. Today, Karen Bud Fallon stated that she believes that the ESA should be incentivized because farmers are the key players in providing habitat and rehabilitation efforts for the endangered species with a cost of land. Then we heard from Sharon Buscino, who explained that the ESA has no need to be incentivized as the farmers and ranchers are already protected under the Safe Harbor Act. Next, we heard from Madison Isley, who encourages incentivizing as she believes that farmers should be have more recognition and understanding from organizations like CBD and NRDC. After hearing Ms. Isley's statement, CBD Representative Ryan Shannon responded with saying that the ESA does not need to be incentivized because the implementation of the ESA policy does not affect the farmer's private property or production. Lastly, Aubrey Bentoncourt countered CBD's argument, claiming that the ESA does need to be incentivized as listing as of the monarch is inevitable and will impact the livelihood of the farmer. Today's question was discussed with the question of incentivizing the Endangered Species Act, and to consider if doing so was good public policy or subsidy for landowners. While there have been several valid and supported claims and arguments made here today, a final decision on the issue is yet to be made. This topic still requires hours of necessary conversation to come to a reasonable and educated conclusion. With this, the committee is now adjourned. Thank you.
All know that sliding off the chair is not part of this job.
I went to look for it and there's no chair.
This would be a time for public and committee to ask questions. Feel free.
Before we ask questions, can each of you introduce yourselves and say what grade you're in? We forgot to do that at the beginning.
I'm Caitlin Hetherington, and I'm a senior this year.
I'm Haley Eider, and I'm also a senior this year.
My name's Emma Haney, and I'm also.
I'm Colton Schick, and I'm a sophomore.
I'm Rachel Abraham, and I'm a senior.
I'm Savannah Schilling, and I'm also a senior.
Talked about how many species were listed. How many have come off the list?
So I could answer that for you, sir. So as we stated in the speech, we said that 99 species out of a total of over 3,000 listings have ever been recovered off the list. That 3,000 species that we talked about was a statistic that we pulled from the species that have ever been listed over the entirety of the act. So only 99 have ever been recovered out of the total over 3,000.
Do you think that the day a species is listed, that it ought to have a determination as to how many of that species exist before, and then it automatically becomes delisted?
So there is a process that it goes through to be completely listed and like have all of the repercussions that come after it. And so they do go through a 12-month process of actually becoming on the list and having all of these things come along with it. And here, let me go to that really fast. And then, so like this one was listed in 2020 and then it went through the 12-month process. And then now it has to come to a decision to see if it's gonna actually like be in effect for us. This December, I believe that it was. And so there is like a certain line of things that have to go along with that in order for a decision to be made, in order for it to be delisted or to be on the list at all.
Adding on to that a little bit, so basically, in order to list a species, you have to have some sort of plan in place for that species and how to basically get it off that list. That way, that they're not basically going in blind. They have some sort of plan to help recover the species.
And referring back to your question, sir, feedback. Asking about counting the species and kind of whether or not that should determine if they come off the list. There have definitely been listings under the ESA before that have come back off the list because there was an error in taxonomic counting or just error in counting the population in an area in general. Something like the monarch butterfly is kind of hard to contain the species to be able to count them and get an accurate count. So there have definitely been species that have been listed that have come back off for those reasons.
Are you aware of any plans that are in force in this state or other states that might help with the delisting of animal plants that have been formally?
So combating that, answering that question for you, sir. So we're talking about the national ESA. So because it's the national ESA, all of the states have to abide by the policies and the rules that they put in effect under the ESA. California is the only one that has a state ESA that's different from the federal, but they still have to abide by the same rules and policies. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the federal policies are going to outweigh anything the state has to say, but the Wyoming does not currently have an ESA that would implement different policies, if that makes sense.
Kind of adding on for like kind of an example, when we spoke to Sharon Buccino over Zoom, they kind of NRDC kind of had this idea of how they wanted to help the monarchs help the monarch recover whenever if it ever did get listed. For example, people were thinking of NRDC was thinking about planting milkweed on sides of roads or like in areas that are not owned by any sort of landowner.
An interesting little tidbit about that California and how the state one will go off and with the federal. So in California, they tried to list some bees as endangered and all this, and what they did, they made it to where the fish are now bees because they classify them as invertebrates. So little whack.
Vice versa.
Oh, vice
No,
versa.
Vice versa. The bees are fish.
The bees are fish, yeah. It's don't ask me.
And then I'm not aware of any local plans, but there has been a plan with it was like the alligator. I can't remember what it was. Basically, they would farm them kind of to help rehabilitate them and bring their population back up. So I think that'd be something interesting, maybe bring into other species to maybe like farm them and bring their populations back up.
Maybe a strange question for you, but who evaluates the economic impact of the listing of a species? You know, I mean, the ramifications of the action would have to be another action. And you alluded to the funding mechanism not needing funding and needing funding, you know, both sides there. But I mean, for every action, there's trickle down economics. You know, if we're losing our farms, stuff like that, what's the value there as opposed to what the species? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you're basically asking for like who, decides the economic portion of the recovery plans. Is that what you're trying to ask?
Yeah, who would put the dollar value, the determining factor of the dollar value based on the action of listing the animal?
As I mentioned in my speech, when we spoke to Sharon Buccino, she was very adamant about the funding of the ESA. She said a lot about how the U.S. government typically handles that, like they have committees for that reason, so that they can basically find the funding to go towards the recovery of the species. But yeah, like I remember her saying that like as I stated, the current funding and the funding that she believed would be the best for the amount of recovery that we need for all of these species. She basically just told us that the funding portion of it comes from the U.S. government itself most of the time, because it is most of the time a national issue. But yeah, that's basically what that is.
Is there a difference in the way the ESA treats a migratory species such as the monarch that reared in a different nation, or even parts of different parts of the continent, as opposed to a domestic species?
So the ESA actually does protect species outside of America. I'm not currently aware of how policies would work for rehabilitation and conservation, but whether like the
Time. She can answer your question, but I'm trying to give the kids an idea of how long the questions in the contest are. So that's just for you.
Oh,
No.
okay. I was
I was like,
what?
Uh-oh.
No, in the contest, the questions stop at
Yeah,
7
yep.
minutes, and I just want you guys to
Okay.
get a sense in your head of when the 7 minutes is. So I sincerely apologize. Keep talking.
Okay. What was I saying? Sorry, that was really distracting.
I'm sorry.
You're okay. The ESA doesn't really, it doesn't matter where the species is, I guess. They're always going to be listed if they're considered threatened or endangered. And then I'm not really aware also of the rehabilitation and conservation if they're migratory. This is something that's kind of new to us.
So I could
I
answer
have a
that from
question.
CBD's perspective, sir. So when I had a conversation with CBD, they said that it doesn't matter if they're migratory or not. Basically, if a farmer or a land where they look at development for a neighborhood per se, if there is habitat that could be claimed as valuable or could inhabit an endangered species, they marked that as critical habitat. So for instance, the monarch butterfly, with it being so migratory and spreading over the United States, basically if a farmer were to have enough acreage on their property that grows milkweed, that would be designated as critical habitat. But that would be permanent because we don't know when the butterflies are coming back or when they would leave. So it wouldn't be treated any differently than critical habitat for a species that's more stuck in one area, if that makes sense.
To follow up on that, is there agreements entered into between the other country or other state that that animal may reside in? Because we don't have any control over how it's treated here unless there's an agreement made too. So it would seem that there's offsetting effects on U.S. producers or U.S. areas due to something that could be mistreated in another misunderstood. Be aware of the agreements that are entered into.
Yeah, all that we really know about the butterfly in the different countries. So right now, all that we know of is like Mexico and Canada, because that's like their main pattern is that they start in Mexico and they go through Canada and then they come back down. And well, yeah, and then so we like looked it up, and Canada does have it listed already. But like the way that it works there is that not all of the territories can like not all of them abide by the major government there, and so it is listed, but not all of them follow the rules. And then in Mexico, it is also listed, and there they have like different like sanctuaries, I guess, for the butterflies, and that's like where the majority of the butterflies go. And so like we don't really like that one, we couldn't really find in English, I guess. And so we couldn't find the like total of how Mexico, I guess, really everyone abides by it, but it is listed in Mexico and Canada, but they again follow different rules. And so, but there is no agreement between like the US that we know of right now, so.
What's the overall economic impact of this whole effort if it does come to fruition or if it does become extinct? Is the economic value decline?
It's pretty well known that butterflies are a pollinator, and I think we can all agree that pollinators are very important, especially to farming and ranching. Well, mainly farming. I don't think ranching has much of a. But without pollinators, we wouldn't have as much crops as we do or as much crop yields, and I think that would have a huge economic impact. I don't know the current number of exactly what economic impact it would have, but if the monarch butterfly did go extinct, I think it would have a pretty detrimental impact.
Follow-up question then, say we supplement the loss of monarch butterflies to increase bee production and or other pollinators. Value been assigned or is that an alternative solution? Best question is ones that have a moment of silence.
I can take a shot at it for you, sir. So when we talk about economic impact, when Caitlin mentioned being able to talk about crop yield and stuff, I definitely think that it wouldn't, either way, you have a loss of impact or less of economics. Just because even if you lose the butterfly and you're trying to restore it with the bee population, eventually the bee population is going to be dwindled down as we expect them to be more present in areas. So I guess it opens it up more to the population of the bee being at risk of being in harm's way if we were to expect them to go into habitat that was designated as butterfly territory. But either way, I think we're at a loss if we're talking from the farmer's perspective.
And then I just want to add that butterfly is a very unique species. Bees actually, they're more of like a hive type thing. So they'll stay close to their hive. As we mentioned, monarch butterflies do migrate, so they're going to be able to pollinate in more places than bees can. So if we did replace it, it still, I don't think, would have the same economic impact or like supplement.
Be some sort of a requirement of bees in like the specific areas. Like they would probably be have to be listed, and then in specific like states and specific areas they would probably have to have like a requirement of the amount of bees that they could have there, I would assume, just because of the migratory pattern. Like there are monarch butterflies in everywhere at one point, but then once they leave, like they obviously like they probably won't come back to the exact same spot, but then like the bees, like she said, they aren't migratory, and so you're going to have them in that specific spot all the time.
So my follow-up question is, so really this is never about save the bees. Save the monarch butterfly at that point.
Good question. I mean, that's kind of what we're.
I love the butterfly.
Yeah. I mean, no one wants it to die, obviously. It's a very important part of a lot of people's culture, especially in Mexico. There was like a documentary we watched. It's a really, really important part of Mexico's culture. So obviously we don't want it to go away. But I think we can all agree that if we had, like, at least from, I think, Aubrey's perspective, if we had to pick, we would pick the loss of the butterfly, just because it's really sad to lose our livelihood just because of one small little insect. And you said we could probably maybe replace it, but I just don't think it's as important as other things might be.
To kind of combat that from the other side, I think CBD would definitely come at it as it's going to come at the cost of farming, like farmers' land. I guess they would look at it as they still have their other acres of land to be able to profit, have crops, graze livestock and whatnot, but to say that only part of their land is being designated as critical habitat, I think they would argue that they would still be able to profit, and we would just be stripping them of that part of their land, but also not offering incentives to them as well.
There have been studies on what defines critical habitat. No, along the black-footed there, they thought that thing was distinct, come from one place, and they studied it intensely, what is done to man form of critical habitat. Do they know what a critical habitat is?
So the definition of critical habitat is kind of loose. It's basically anywhere that they would rely on food, habitats, like anywhere they would like sleep, migrate, mate. So just anywhere that they would be. So it's really loose definition. Right now for the butterfly, we're just looking at anywhere that milkweed is at, just because as we did mention, milkweed is where they do rely on for their main food source and where they lay their eggs.
Kind of sorry. Kind of adding on to that, like she mentioned, the monarch, like their food source and where they lay their eggs is mainly the milkweed. Because of them being like they migrate a lot, they don't typically obviously stay in one spot very long. It's kind of hard. I feel like in some ways it's kind of hard to have a specific critical habitat other than like areas with milkweed in a sense.
Speaking of that, what is the natural predator of the bug? We'd be looking at that as a habitat.
For the monarch butterfly, there's a lot of pesticides and herbicides that go along with that. So say like a rancher or a farmer puts down some pesticide or herbicide, and it's where milkweed and stuff is planted for that ideal habitat. Not only is it toxic to the livestock and crops, but they could just be getting rid of weeds. But the monarch butterfly, it could potentially kill them later on if they migrate to that area as they are going through the different areas.
I guess to combat that, sort of while she made the comment about the use of pesticides, I definitely think it's fair. The argument of GMOs would also come up. We see the herbicide-resistant crops coming up to say that it's still safe for the public while being able to still resist the herbicides while killing off the milkweed and whatnot. But I definitely think that there would be a consumer argument as well, that the GMO crops that we're modifying to be resistant to those herbicides, and that would raise public awareness as well.
My question was the natural. You're talking about artificial. What is the natural predator? Is it the sparrow? Is it the robin? Is it the, what is the natural predator to the monarch? Are they out of balance?
So the monarch butterfly has tons of natural predators. The weather can be a big one. So especially with them migrating, the weather differentiates between different states. Like rain and snow can really hurt them. And then you got to look at spiders, as you said, like birds, even cats, like anything can kill them. They're kind of, fragile. So they have tons of natural predators. So it'd be kind of hard to limit and narrow it down to one predator. That's probably going to limit the population. So we can't really limit it to one.
Looks like we're done. Thank you very much.
For feedback, would that be something we could ask you for?
You should take a managerial, from my perspective, a managerial approach to manage these committees. So you're not overseeing
and just kind of really narrow it down to where really look back and forth, like more of a committee meeting. So, thank you.
As you continue to do this, you'll be more comfortable with your beginning parts of that. As time goes on and you do more and more presentations, you'll have an arsenal of ways of answering questions for them. I believe that will become easier as time goes on. I think you were well prepared for the questions asked.
Several comments, my daughter's so we have this debate in our house, like, and so it's very common after high school days. So I would urge you to try to take that out of the pictures. And I know it's difficult because so work on that one, and because he's, I mean, lost question because that's where you shine, right? You practice getting that down. Question and answer. Knowledge. Work on that. Make your crisp, clear, to the point. Plus, you get more answers, right? Pulling them off, you actually know how your judgment. So as you practice, you have the best coaches in the world. Right? Practice. And get all your terminology. Like I was noticed when you used the word when we were talking about but really work on. I would say
And if you are stuck, don't giggle or do any of that. Just pause for a minute, gather your thoughts. Pause is better than or stumbling with trying to think of what to say. Just pause and gather your thoughts. In case you can't quickly.
great job.
Yes.
Yes, good job.
Representatives, take a picture.